It is my delight and pleasure to have Dr. Jeff Liou back on our podcast. Jeff Liou is the National Director of Theological Formation with InterVarsity, and as well as a co author with Robert Chao Romero of Christianity and Critical Race Theory. Jeff, I'm glad to have you back on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me back. Love being here with you.
I want to talk about ministry to Gen Z, in particular, Asian American Gen Z Christians. And I think you have a college age child and I have a teenage child. So we have something personally at stake in the question of Gen Z. And I'm going to define it. And I'm going to search this really quick here. Do you know the age range for Gen Z?
I use the general rule of thumb is born in 2000 or
Ooh, you do.
after.
I like that. I like that.
Yeah.
Those generally born in 2000. Um, so to begin, I was preparing this morning for our podcast conversation. I'm gonna test your Gen Z slang vogue.
Oh no. Okay.
All right. I'm gonna some of these might be easy, but what do you think bussin' means?
Oh, bussin' means it tastes good, or it's a hot commodity. It's a good item.
All right. This is a good start. How about low key, high key?
Okay, so I'm not sure about the technical definition, but like high key is emphatic and low key is understated. So if I low key like something, then it's clear that I like it, but it's not like I emphatically like it. But if I high key like something, I want people to know. That's my understanding of it.
Wait, how old are your kids?
So my daughter's 18
Okay.
and my son is 15.
So they were born in the 2000s?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah.
So this is too easy for you.
We'll see. We'll
Let's
see.
find something else here. Drip,
Drip is your fashion sense, especially if it's good.
no cap.
I'm not lying.
You're gonna get 100% here. All right, last one. Yeet.
Yeet is to technically it's to throw something, but it's not just objects that can be thrown. You can yeet things metaphorically as well.
Dude, you like gave the exact definition according to my chat GPT search this morning. So
Oh
you
man,
get an
oh
A
man.
plus, Jeff.
One of the things we learn how to do, I know you know this, as Asian Americans, we learn to code switch. And I think it's not just racial code switching, there's generational code switching. And man, what kind of college minister would I be if I couldn't speak the language of the folks
I figured you'd be
then?
a good person on this topic of ministry to Asian American Gen Z. Um, you know, when we did the podcast on your book, one of the last questions kind of opened up this on ramp to today's podcast. You were talking about, uh, you were exhorting Gen Z Asian American Christians to take ownership of their place in church, to not throw away that inheritance. And I think you were offering a general exhortation for faith leaders more broadly to remove barriers for Gen Z's affiliation or membership or attendance or participation in church. And so I think that prompted my desire to have this kind of follow up podcast
Yeah,
with you. So let's just dive right into it. And I want to focus on Asian American Christians and to
sure.
stipulate that not all Asian American Christians attend Asian American churches. Some of them may only have access to pan ethnic or predominantly white churches. And so we need to figure that dynamic into the discussion. But let's say I would like to kind of tilt the conversation towards uh, predominantly Asian congregations, and then we can kind of expand from that. Um, but what do you? And I think we can frame this as generational differences or generational dynamics, and
Mhm.
how one of my own presuppositions is back in the 90s when Helen Lee wrote Silent Exodus, talking about second gen Asian American Christians creating English ministries as a faith of their own. We've now become, as a second gen, sort of Gen X Asian American Christian, we collectively, my generation, has become very good at creating those EMs. So good that we think they're good enough for the third gen or Gen Z. I think I think that supposition does not necessarily follow. Just
Mm,
because it was working well for us, it
mhm.
ought not be expected to work well for Gen Z Asian American Christians. And I see you
Yeah,
nodding your head. So I just want to invite your preliminary thoughts on some of these barriers for entry, affiliation, membership, ownership.
sure, and they really are preliminary thoughts. I think your astute listeners who do their homework can Google me and make judgments about whether I'm qualified to speak on this. I am a member at a multi ethnic church, a relatively large church in Southern California. I'm still connected to a handful of Asian American churches, um, and certainly I have colleagues and have worked with students in the last 5-10 years who would qualify as the demographic that we're talking about. So I want to make those qualifiers really clear. I currently attend a multi-ethnic church and have for the last 15 years. Um, so thinking about predominantly Asian American spaces, uh, yes, the lore, the legend, is from the immigrant generation to the EM generation, and then now what? What's making it difficult? Um, I'm generally aware of the sociological work, the survey research that's being done on younger Asian American Christians, their trends in disaffiliation, and some of Russell Jung's work thinking about millennials on down and how they express their Christianity. Um, that they're influenced. I think for the EM generation, the Gen X generation, the continuity between the values of our parents and the ministries that we create, that continuity was somewhat important. There were natural discontinuities, language, for example, right? But some of the theological, ethical values are, we were deliberate about honoring what came before. In fact, when you look at Gen X theologians and Christian leaders thinking and writing about Christianity and their spirituality, there is so much about honoring the generation that came before. Well, you get to our kids' generation, and my kids love ama and akong. They absolutely love them. And when they go into ama and akong's home, their space, you can see the way that I honor ama and akong at work with my children. But that's different from the kind of Christian spaces that they might go into now. Like it's not that they have the same kind of familial sense that you or I might. Now they have other questions that are ringing in their ethical imaginations about whether this space is for me or not, whether this kind of church is for me, and whether I can invite my friends there, and whether these are the kinds of theological, ethical values that I want to espouse. Those things are changing, and one of the things Russell Jung suggests is that they're more influenced by American individualism than our generation was. I certainly think that's true. And some of those sociocultural forces are certainly at work.
That's fascinating. I'm just processing
Mhm.
the shifting social environments that each generation faces that then spurs a faith formation suited for those social conditions, right? So it ought not surprise us that there is both continuity and discontinuity across even the same family. So I really
That's right.
appreciate your use of your own family to illustrate there's a shared love of the extended family, but perhaps a different expression of that love. And this then, I'm going to translate it into an ecclesial or kind of a ministry praxis challenge. This then means, how do our ministries reflect that dynamism? Because institutions and their management are much better at solidifying practices rather than making them plastic, right? It's like we want to plug and chug. So if I'm managing a 30-year-old institution, it's much easier for me just to go to the tried and true that work in the past
Mhm.
rather than to fumble around for new practices, new models, new
Yeah.
theologies, even
Mhm.
that justify these different practices for the next generation.
Right.
It's easier just to break them off and just to say, hey, go form your own community, right? So I think this is where the challenge lies, is how do we raise consciousness within existing leadership about the differences and the similarities with the next generation, if we want them to worship in the same space as us. Like that may
Sure.
and that question is a live question, right?
Yeah, it's an open question. Absolutely. I mean, I'm hoping, and I'm sure folks are studying and writing about this, but I'm hoping that churches at the everyday level, not just at the academic level or the the more cottage Asian American ministry learning spaces, right? Um, at the general level, I hope churches are learning from the now decades long experiment in going from one generation to the next. Because if we learn nothing about those tensions and the kinds of discontinuities that we must learn to tolerate, um, then we'll continue to make the same mistakes, especially for Gen X, EM type churches looking at millennial and Gen Z spirituality going forward. So the main question is who is our church working for? Like, for whom is it a great space, and why? And is it possible to encompass more than we currently do and still maintain the distinctives that we find are precious to us?
Yep.
And I don't want to be like prescriptive about that, because it may be the case, like you said, it's an open question. May be the case that encompassing another target group, another culture, another generation, or whatever it might be, may so dramatically alter the DNA of the place that we're at that we're not the same thing. And if that's not okay for the stakeholders, hopefully it's not driven by power or money or things like that, but really driven by mission and a sense of the Spirit's leading. If it, you know, if the stakeholders can't tolerate that disruption, it may be appropriate, and we shouldn't wring our hands then about the need to create or launch something new.
This is the thought that popped in my mind. It's just a comment. We don't have to pursue it, but
Mm.
because I have this other thread I want to pursue. You alluded to how, so one, I do think generations are different cultures. If we define cultures not only by linguistic practice, but by cultural norms and mores and social practices.
Mhm.
And we began with the slang thing, right? So that shows a different linguistic practice of Gen
Yeah.
Z that is like a different language to me. Like I
Right.
had to look this stuff up, and I
Sure.
can in, intimate certain things by its practice, but it's still foreign to me because I don't use it.
Yeah.
Um, Different generations are different cultures
Mhm.
and so a church that then needs to adapt to a different culture becomes a different church.
I think so. I think you're right about that. Yeah.
And then that then needs to be made explicit and intentional, right?
Mhm.
Then if the church understands, well, we need to serve the young people, therefore we
Mhm.
need to shift certain habits and practices and mindsets
Right.
to accommodate their differences.
Yeah.
And that can all, and note, this can all be very personal. If you want to worship with your grandchildren, like you can keep it just familial, like
Mhm.
even within the same exact kinship
Mhm.
family structure, this is the case. much less different racial groups, different class or socioeconomic groups, right? So we don't even have to
Absolutely.
go there. We can just stay within our closest nuclear,
Yeah.
extended family thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I see you nodding. So we can just kind of keep that in the background. Here's I want to pick up something from our previous podcast about a church audit and how
Mhm.
this lies within that sort of conversation we were having about power analysis within structures and systems, within institutions.
Right.
Um, and I want to do some audits of ministries. We can call they can be campus ministries, they could be church ministries, and they can involve Asians in the majority or minority. And given your role at InterVarsity, I would love to hear some of the audits over the last few decades. So, depending on how long your tenure has been at InterVarsity,
Mhm.
what is being done differently today with Gen Z Asian American Christians as ministry
Yeah.
practices versus 10, 20, 30 years ago when we look at the audit lines? And I use the metaphor of these audit lines because it gives us something concrete to kind of focus on.
Sure.
And because you're an ordained minister, it's like, yes, these are the practices that have shifted or not. And then
Yeah.
you're also a theologian. So you and I, we can theologize about the significance of these changes in our audits.
Mm. Yeah. Great question. So, you can only ask this question to a person who has been around for decades, which I'm I'm still becoming accustomed to a person who's been in ministry for decades. It's pretty wild. Um, Someone called me middle aged the other day, and I'm like, wow, that's exactly right. uh, I'll get
You're
over it.
still young, hip,
Um,
and cool to me, Jeff.
I'll get over it, but thank you. Appreciate that. So when I joined university as a student in the 90s, we were just beginning to talk about quote unquote ethnic specific ministry. There were papers that were floating around at the staff level that were giving theological and ministry rationales for ethnic specific ministry. So that was my entry point. I graduated from high school in 97. So that'll give you a sense of the scale of time. Um, the first book that I read on Asian American Christianity was Following Jesus Without Dishonoring Your Parents. Now, decades later, that seems like a very early conversation, one that took a look at a relatively narrow scope of what it means to be Asian American and the Asian American experience. And I think if there was any mistake that we continued to make as Asian American Christians is to think that what it means to be Asian American is a narrow set of body types, and B, a narrow set of experiences in the United States. So, over the course of decades, leading to a book like our colleague Sabrina Chan, who leads the Asian American Ministries Department, shout out to them because they are leading in this space. And, I would commend their work to your listeners. Um, they've written a book called Learning Our Names, which represents a much wider kind of demographic coverage. Um, and also the updated kind of set of experiences that may comprise what it means to be Asian American in the United States. Expanding the set of possibilities, expanding the conversations because of what being Asian American includes in the United States, both like in terms of the census, in terms of like the political milieu that we live in. These are the changes that I'm watching over time. Uh, but we're also keeping track. I think we're also keeping track of the evolution of whiteness, white supremacy, and the way that they impinge on Asian American identity and ministry. There are, as I think I alluded to last time, innovations. I mean, racism is crafty. So there are innovations and evolutions in racism that calls for our attention to how the Asian American experience is changing, not simply because we're including more demographics, but because there are real cultural changes at work.
So, shout out to Sabrina Chan and her co-authors for learning our names. We had David De Leon and Sabrina Chan on our podcast and with one of our events last year. So folks can look up that podcast conversation with Sabrina and David. I want to press you on that last point about the changes. So let's say someone took a snapshot of a typical Asian American ministry on campus in the 90s versus
Mm,
right now.
mhm.
What would be continuous and what would be discontinuous in that kind of Asian American ministry context?
Yeah, great question. So one of the continuous questions that I've fielded, and I know many of my colleagues continue to field, is what do I do about my parents? So especially in the case of immigrant parents, the values clash is still there. The cultural kind of acclimatization process is still ongoing for parents who've immigrated to the United States. But the tools and the stories are many now. Like there's people like you and I who are speaking into the podcast sphere. Uh, so younger people have access to stories like ours. So the conversations themselves are continuous. One of the things that's definitely discontinuous from 1990, uh, late 90s, is kind of, I'll give you an example. So vocation has changed entirely. My daughter is an artist, right? So she went to an arts high school, and she will go on to study advertising and marketing, but with an emphasis in graphic design. I was not encouraged in the arts or anything that was not STEM. And in '97, there were so many of us who were doing business, medicine, law. The trope of Asian American Christian vocational conversations. I think that has changed so much that navigating American life and finding our vocational or our career path is there's so many more tools, and universities have tools. They have career counseling. There's so much more on offer to the next generations that the conversations are just different. The possibilities are just far more open because parents can now see a financially viable pathway for their children. So we have an opportunity to ask more questions about vocation, and passion, even though this economy might not allow it. So the state that we're in is so different from what we were experiencing in the late '90s, early 2000s.
Hearing you reflect about the discontinuity in vocation, that jives with my own amateur sociological armchair reflections. To be a good Asian American child in the 90s was to go to medical school, maybe business school.
Hmm.
Definitely engineering was a standard kind of acceptable career path.
Right.
Accounting, something practical, and that was
Yeah.
and that provided financial stability. Maybe law school, although it sounds good, but I'm not sure my parents would have known what I don't know, what lawyers do.
Yeah. I mean, when Wong Fu and Kev Jumba and Ryan Higa, they're making a living off of YouTube, and they just blow open the possibility of not going to medical school. Like, how can the succeeding generations not ask questions about what's really available to them? It's just
Shout out
the golden age
to
of
them
YouTube.
and the Fung Bros and all the kind
Yeah.
of YouTubers and social media influencers who take Asian American storytelling and culture and
That's right.
community seriously. Let's let's extend this conversation of vocation and run through some other potential points of discontinuity. And we'll begin with race. Like, do you
Mm.
think that Asian American college students have a more developed racial consciousness than their analog in the 90s?
Whew. So I'll put on my race scholar hat for a second, and I want to give a qualified no. Because for me, racial consciousness is a developmental kind of pathway, right? So it's not just something that can be downloaded or soaked in from the culture. It really does involve the cultivation of a set of habits, and also a set of experiences have to be had, whatever those might be. Now, the experiences and the habits that they can change, which gives rise to the evolution of what any racial category really means. Um, but I I think because it's encased in habits and experiences, that until you develop those habits and have those experiences, you're on a pathway from thin to thick racial identity. So we may be more articulate, have more vocabulary, but to me that doesn't mean that we have a greater sense of our ability to navigate the racialized waters that we live in.
That's fascinating. Do you think you're qualified? No. So you're basically saying that an Asian college student in the 90s and their level of racial awareness and today's Asian college students' level of racial awareness are in the same band. They're more similar than dissimilar. My follow up comment question is, do you think it's because Asian college students are still within the Asian bubble of protection or
Oh, that's a great question.
insulation?
Well, I do think that there's a lot more media to consume about being Asian
See, that
American.
that's sorry to interrupt, but I think that's
No.
my thought about why we would have expected more racial self-awareness is it's just a starting point of, "Hey, I'm Asian American. I can take
Mhm.
pride in, kind of, BTS and, all these movies and kind
Yeah.
of popular media Asian
Yes.
celebrating type of things."
That's a great point. But I think for some race scholars, and I'll just say for me, there is a kind of boutique multiculturalism or boutique racial awareness that centers around cue practices, maybe foods, but that doesn't translate to real navigation of difference. So we may be more aware of the vocabulary and the concepts, the stories and the cultural artifacts. That awareness skyrocketing, right? Um, but the internal sense that we have agency when it comes to navigating the racialized culture in which we live, the the racial economy, the racial capitalism, all of these ways of understanding racialized life in the United States. It's not clear to me that having a boutique understanding of certain foods or artifacts translates into having a sense of, and this is my measure, a sense of well-being as we live in a diverse world. I think the evidence for that, just really speaking personally, is the plummeting sense of well-being among young people in general, but you can see it in Asian Americans in specific as well. I mean, the way that well-being conversations impact young Asian Americans, it has something to do, in my mind, with our ability to navigate a racialized world, because that's in part what it means to be an Asian American, is to be aware of racialization and the dynamics thereof in the United States. So, I mean, our the number of artifacts and our awareness of them, absolutely on the rise. Does that necessarily mean that we're better at navigating because we know more? I just don't think that that's really ever the case. That more knowledge means more understanding.
I'm thinking about this quote from the church father Irenaeus: "The glory of God is in a human fully alive."
Mm,
I think our Westminster Catechism also has a similar type of theology where the fullness of our humanity is to be worshipers of God. Uh, so, to bring some theology into this notion of well being, and if churches and their discipleship programs and their emphasis on spiritual growth have the end of spiritual and theological well being, we could call this holiness, we could call this sanctification. These are all the teleological, anthropological terms as applied to human creatures made in the image of God. Then what I hear you say, so I'm going to break down two things that I hear you
yeah.
explicitly.
You're really good at this, by the
What's
way.
that?
I love the way you break things down, so you're really good
Okay.
at that.
So
Eh,
the first piece is our well being. as Asian Americans requires some investment in the race conversation because we cannot ignore how we've been racialized and how that racialization interferes or is a barrier to our well-being. Okay, so
Mhm.
that's the first point that I'm inferring from your claim. And that's
Okay.
a really serious hook. You're basically
Mm.
saying then that our sanctification programs, our discipleship programs, our views of spirituality cannot ignore the fact that we've been racialized if we want well-being as an end of these ministries in participation with the Holy Spirit of Christ.
Right.
Then secondly, this I guess this is just another this is just to kind of ecclesialize the the first point, which is then our churches and our ministries need to expand or develop curriculum
Mhm.
that accounts for the first point, that race matters not
Mhm.
just for engaging in public discourse, but you know, selfishly, it matters for the well-being of the church.
Yeah.
Um, and I think it's very important to state this in theological terms, not just in secular CRT terms. And I would begin by always pointing to the particular embodiment of our Lord, Jesus Christ, who came not in generic flesh, but came in
Right.
Jewish flesh in a
Right.
particular time and spoke in the idioms of that time, within the customs and social mores of that time to maximally give perfect witness to his heavenly Father. And
Mhm.
so if we really love Jesus and want to do what Jesus did, we have to examine just how seriously Jesus took social embodiment and how that ought to be a pattern for our own ecclesial ministries.
100%, David. I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking about a church that just consistently refuses to engage these conversations. It's an Asian American church. And you can see that the end product of their discipleship is a Christian that doesn't understand the world that we live in and also refuses to engage in that world. And maybe they refuse to engage because they don't understand the characterizing kind of posture towards the outside culture is one of either fear or apathy. It's a fear of contagion, or it's the perspective that what goes on outside the walls of the church is irrelevant. Now, the wreckage of a space like that is folks whose calling is to make culture, calling to understand more deeply their own story and how it interfaces with a diverse world, um, or people who are simply oriented that way. I I deal with Christians who can't stay in spaces like that anymore because what they're being told every week is that the stuff that they care about doesn't matter. And as my program was in theology and culture. As a person who sees God at work in every corner of creation, uh, I want to help folks like that think about what God has done and is doing inside their Asian American body, right, and in their culture. So church spaces that are not cultivating that, I don't think really have a hope of retaining Asian American Christians in the future. They can retain Christians in the future, but their eye is not towards Asian American Christians. It's some generic kind of believer, uh, and they may be perfectly happy with that. And I don't want to denigrate that. But if we're talking about cultivating Asian American Christianity with any kind of deliberateness, I, the tension that you are referring to, I think is right on.
Let me direct us towards this, and you hit upon it just now, the passions of Asian American Christians, especially at the campus level. So these are
Mhm,
college students, because I feel like the college chapter of life opens a
mhm,
lot of choices. Do I continue to identify as a Christian? What is my major?
mhm,
What pathway after college vocationally will I pursue? Who will I marry if I do get
mhm,
married?
mhm,
Um, all these kind of large identity type questions are being they're in the mix in those college chapter years.
Yeah.
And because church membership, church ministry is about God, who is the ultimate good, it's about our most sacred value.
Hmm.
The end of our life is to worship and to witness to God's goodness. Then it makes sense for church pastors who may be listening in on this podcast, especially Asian American faith leaders, to better understand the sacred values driving our Asian American young people. And so
Amen.
I'm going to ask you to play amateur ethnographer and your
Okay.
kind of participant observation of
Yeah.
are Asian Americans on campuses. What and you can kind of cover the full range here, but what based on their behavior, what are their sacred values? And it could be something like gaming. It's like
Yeah.
they just like love to game, or it
Yeah.
could be, I don't know, grabbing meals together, or it could be worship together. I don't
Hmm.
want to come with any presuppositions, but what would you begin to, how would you begin to describe to our kind of established church leadership some of the sacred values you see circulating within the Asian American campus ministry scene?
Okay, so I can talk about sacred values a little bit, but I think what's clearer to me as an amateur ethnographer is the less sacred. I don't want to say secular, but they are central. They do connect to the sense of ultimate good, but they are racked with that they're strongly influenced by the political economy in which we live. Um, the pandemic and the economic crisis have changed more than I think people tend to estimate. Um, so, returning to the question of vocation, uh, in the late '90s, early 2000s, we talked about passion in terms of a sense of calling. Where does your great passion meet the world's great need, right? Now that's still floating around, but the need to be gainfully employed and to be financially sustainable and to have great work life balance. These, I don't know if I'd call them sacred values, right? But the need to be financially viable after college, I think, is changing the conversation about what major I pursue. So my daughter could have been just a straight up graphic artist, right? That path is more uncertain, I think, than marketing and advertising, which there of that need there will be no end, and it has all kinds of formational implications that I think about as a theologian of culture for her spirituality. But um, if I were prescribing based on my sacred values for my daughter, I would be really worried about the formational impact of marketing and advertising. But that's not the kind of conversation that a lot of Asian American Christians or Gen Z Christians in general are asking themselves. They're asking, how do I survive in an economy in which it may be impossible for me to own a home? Uh, my interest rate, I refinanced in 2021. And so now I'm locked in at a rate that I'm not excited to give up anytime soon. It's just going to be difficult now for the next generation. And so that forces a different set of questions for them vocationally. Now, if the flip side of that coin, if there is something sacred about it, it's that work life balance piece. So, in terms of vocation, is there an employer, and we're primarily thinking about it, employers that values my time? It, young workers are no longer thinking about whether I should be loyal to the company or whether it's a family that I'll enjoy. Um, they are thinking about what is my contractual obligation, how do I fulfill it, and not do more than I'm being paid for. That's a very different theology of work, isn't it? And that goes for Gen Z in general. So, to be very concrete, we look at it in InterVarsity in terms of our employment numbers. Because of the pandemic, but because of other forces, we have been, in the last 5 years, seeing a precipitous drop in people considering InterVarsity staff to be a viable career. And we still lose staff because of our fundraising kind of we raise our funds for salary and benefits. That's a challenge, especially in this economic kind of environment. We have seen an uptick in the last year, which is encouraging to us. But I think if we're prudential and thoughtful, we'll be really concerned about not just the economic environment, but also what that has done to the theology of vocation of young people. Um, yeah.
Those 2 points are fantastic concrete examples. The first one was about the pressures of vocation and job after college and the desire to tackle those financial pressures. And we haven't even mentioned college student loan debt to alleviate, on top
Right,
of the desire to purchase a home at some point in one's life, given how
right,
difficult it is to come down with a down payment or high mortgage
absolutely.
rates. And
Mhm.
then once they have settled on a vocation, you alluded to the second challenge, which is, hey, I'm just going to give the bare minimum per my contract because I value other things other than being a slave to the corporate world.
Mhm, mhm. Yep,
What
that's right.
continue with the list, like, continue with the observations. What else
Sure.
really drives or animates? So, I think sacred value, that's an interesting way to parse it. It's kinda like, well, sacred value has a positive normative, illusion. Let's just bracket that and just talk about drivers,
Mm,
where the energy's at, things that are motivating, whether out of fear or joy, love or disappointment. Um,
mm.
do other let me throw a couple things out there and then you tell me what
Sure.
sticks. Do you think there's much more climate anxiety amongst the younger generation that actually motivates behavioral change? Do
Mm,
you think that issues about social justice or racial justice, is it again only at the level of ornamental talk? Or are there vocational decisions and lifestyle
mhm,
changes that are
mhm,
reflecting that type of commitment? And we would even fold in gender equality,
mhm.
given the Me Too movement over the last decade or so. So that's kind of on the societal front.
Yeah.
But do you see those as drivers of changes in behavior?
This is a crucial question. I think, for folks that watch cultural trends and societal trends, theological trends, ministry trends, my own conclusion has been the pendulum is always swinging. Culture is a moving target. There's constant evolution happening. So that's my fundamental posture as a theologian of culture. That it's a moving target. What we're talking about now is not going to be the same conversation a few months down the road, even because the pace of change is so fast. So, what do folks really care about? What does drive young people? If you talked to me a couple years ago, I would have said environmental concerns. Yeah, maybe, right? Would I say that today? I think that there has been a pendulum swing. Now, one of the forces that I do keep track of is the sum, the cumulative effect of activist movements, and some of the research that's been done on the effectiveness of activist movements is there is kind of a threshold if an activist movement is goes beyond the tolerance level of the people that they're trying to mobilize, then it actually galvanizes them against the cause that they're championing. That happens frequently enough, and in in the media spotlight. So the drivers of the public's attention, including social media and mainstream media, they make it seem like exceeding the threshold or the tolerance of people who need to be mobilized happens enough that the pendulum swings in the other direction. So I'll give you an example. John Perkins, legendary living legend, civil rights activist, he used to say that. I think he continues to say that he believes that there is a hunger and a thirst for racial justice and racial righteousness that he's excited about. Now, I think that those kinds of comments have been said for decades without discontinuation. I've also heard similar things about young people's spiritual hunger. I've heard that for decades, as if there has been no cultural change. Young people are still hungry for Jesus. Young people still care about this and that. I think that's always going to be true. There will be some percentage that gets our attention, that we get excited about their hunger for whether it's spirituality or for justice and righteousness. But it's certainly not the preponderance of young people. The evidence for that is disaffiliation. It's not the preponderance of people. And churches who are looking for a silver bullet to retain young people or to catch a cultural wave, we are so fragmented now that I would advise churches against kind of going that route of finding some kind of church growth hook that can get them the next generation. I would be worried about that in part because of the moving target phenomenon, but in part because I'm not sure we read things right.
Silver bullets are difficult because they assume a one silver bullet fits all churches. And each church is going to have, and this is kind of something that's bearing in my field work, there are going to be ethnic differences between Korean communities, Chinese communities, Hmong refugee communities. There's going to be differences between first, second, third, fourth, fifth generational contexts.
Mhm.
Then West Coast Christians are going to be Asian Christians are going to be different from East Coast, are going to be different from the South, are going to be different from Midwest type
Mhm.
of Asian American Christians. So the one size fits all thing really doesn't even work within Asian America.
Right.
So that's a really important caution to issue. Um,
But you know, one of the things I am aware of in terms of generational studies, um, and I think this goes not just for Gen Z, but also for older generations, the propensity or the desire for it's I don't want to say an easy fix, but it's the silver bullet concept. It's that we want a concrete step, right? So I've done a lot of podcasts. I've written a lot of articles. One of the pieces of feedback that persistently comes is like, what is our next step, right? Like we need 5 easy steps to get to retaining Gen Z or whatever. Those things just don't exist. You know, as plea to your listeners, you know intuitively that it is complex. And so rather than investing in, you know, some blog that gives you 5 steps, invest in your ability to discern the spirit of Jesus working among a population that you don't understand very well. So invest in your own spirituality as opposed to, you know, some youth center's 5 steps, right? Like I want to plead to your listeners to really root themselves in a spirituality that is discerning.
One of my sort of closing takeaway thoughts from this conversation was your earlier response of the modified no when it comes to, are today's Asian American Christians, the younger Christians, more racially conscious than 30 years ago? And I'm still mulling over that. In one of my ways of interpreting the modified no, they aren't. There's more similarity than dissimilarity, has to do with the through line of the political economy of American society, namely racial capitalism, that
Mhm.
was operative 30 years ago and is arguably stronger today than it was then,
Yeah,
in how
yeah.
the consumerism and just the vocation question, the housing prices, our banking industry, like student loan rates, mortgage rates, these are all then tightly wound within that capitalist financial structure that has
Mhm.
political, economic, and racial capitalist determinations.
Mhm.
And so for the nerds out there, I just want to give a shout out to Catherine Lofton's article from 2014. I've been spending a lot of time thinking about this article titled "Commonly Modern: Rethinking the Modernist Fundamentalist Controversies." The reason I'm giving a shout out to this article by Catherine Lofton, a religion scholar at Yale, is because
mm,
she says whenever there are binaries, and the study of the modernist fundamentalist controversy in the 1920s is one of these
mm,
binaries, eludes what is commonly shared. And what's
mm,
emerging to me is, hmm, maybe we're treating first gen, second gen as a kind of antipode or binary structure, when in fact
mm,
there's much more that is shared across that binary than we are supposing. And I think I'm identifying the political economy of American society that is shared across the generation, that then winds them tighter than might be supposed,
mhm.
despite the linguistic and cultural differences, right? So we can
Right.
account for both the divergence of the generations, but we need to also account for the convergence of the generations.
Sure.
And one of the indicators of this is the vocational drive, right? And which directly
Yeah.
ties into the political economic questions.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I think what's shared across all of it is the assumption um, that we deserve to make it in this place, right? That this is a political economy that should work for us. That this is a political environment or political culture that should express our needs and meet our needs. I mean, you just take a look at the great hope that we place in representation in media and on the news. We put a lot of hope there. We're looking for a home here. And we share that with first gen immigrant parents, but we share that, in our conversations about alienation and erasure in second gen. We share that in trying to buy a home for Gen Z workers. The shared assumption that we should be able to make it in this place, versus uh, I think the scriptures cautionary motif to us that we are aliens and foreigners. So we've been that. Why would we want to go back to thinking about our foreignness and our alienation? I think that's the spiritual posture or mode that we are encouraged to consider or to adopt. Now, there are senses in which we're trying to make home, and Reformed Christians like to quote Jeremiah 29 about seeking the welfare of the city and making your home there, etc. I'm worried that that's become an excuse for adopting the political economy,
Right. Right.
and
So
yeah,
let's maybe this can be our concluding reflection is on, so our home is not of this earth, but it awaits us. There's an eschatological home, which is our true home and true belonging.
mm,
Eschatology can be a tricky thing because it
sure,
can excuse and create political apathy, as well as, hey, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. We can just let go of it
mm,
and focus on the
yeah,
eternal afterlife, right? So,
right,
which is, I don't think, part of our Christian responsibility. I think we have many things in scripture that call us to action, being stewards of God's creation in the here
right,
and now.
right.
So we have to balance the already and the not yet of the eschaton. So I see you nodding. So yes, I'm on firm ground here. So
Yes.
I'll ask the direct question, then I'll fill it out. So what can today's Asian American Christian college students do as just one small voice
Mm,
in the massive ocean of racial capitalism? They're looking to pay back student loans and, eventually save enough to get married and have a home just to survive.
mhm,
They're not in a position as the CEO of a Fortune 500 company to lower wage earnings and to diminish what the janitor from the CEO makes. They're not in charge of policy at that level. They're not the federal, chair of the Federal Reserve that can control how much we do X, Y, and Z. They're not the robber barons who can kind of change massive financial policies that seem to run with a life of their own. So when I start listing it out that way, it
mhm.
creates a sense of overwhelmingness akin to the eschatological posture of,
Yes.
hey, there's nothing I can do. I might as
Right.
well just carve out something that works for me. Right. So
Yeah.
I want to resist that temptation. what are the alternatives then?
So here's my recommendation. Investment in the local is the kind of developmental experience that I think actually helps us to navigate uh, the racialized world that we live in. I think when we are looking for that, we're using that same survival instinct that our ancestors had that immigrated to the United States, that displaced them from from their home, that made it so that we didn't learn the mother tongue like we could have. In many cases, that same survival instinct disconnects you from the local in such a way that you're no longer able to fulfill the Bible's vision, moral vision, spiritual vision for you as a person who loves God and the world that God creates. It's investment in the local. I mean, Willie Jennings says, "Get your hands in the soil," right? So that's kind of what I'm aiming at is your local community, whoever is there, your personal investment there, that their welfare is tied up with your welfare. That's the kind of spiritual moral instinct that prepares you, I think, to navigate a world of racial difference, without which we are really capitulating to an individualist mindset that tells us we can float anywhere as long as it is good for you and your, nuclear family, or you and your partner and children, or just for you. Uh, I think that kind of disconnecting force has to be fought with a rugged investment in the local. That's my very specific. That's as specific as I can get without maybe over prescribing.
I love it. Invest in the local as a form of Christian obedience, witness, and discipleship. And this does have political economic implications. Um, it also fits very well with sort of grassroots democratic politics that folks like Luke Bretherton, as well as my colleague Aaron Stauffer, and our recent podcast, we've been talking about broad-based community organizing. Let me last kind of follow up. When we
Yeah.
talk about investment in the local, differentiate between natural environment, built environment. So getting our hands in the soil, that's the natural
Hmm.
environment.
Sure.
But I also imagine the PTA or kind
Yeah.
of showing up for community events with other people that may be different from us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Being part of the neighborhood gathering when there's
Yeah.
uh, a festival or an event.
Yeah.
How do you, as patterns of discipleship practice, like I want to reimagine what
Mhm.
discipleship means when we invest in the local.
Okay, okay. I'll start with a metaphorical example and then move to the real. So when I was early on in campus ministry, students want to pick where they live on campus, whether it's an apartment or a dorm, and their calculus is predictably self-centered, right? And who can blame them? You don't want to live in the dump. You want to live in the modern, dorm, or you want to live in the apartment next to the grocery store, or whatever. You have all these druthers, right? It never made sense, but I'm sticking by it, David, to recommend to students to really think as disciples. Where would the Spirit lead you to live, even if that entailed some discomfort? Now, I'm not prescribing discomfort for prescribing discomfort's sake, but let's move to the question at hand. Um, in terms of investment in the local, I learned from some of my colleagues who are in ministry in Detroit that the requisite number of years it takes to make a difference is at least 10. So we live in a world where transience is just kind of normal, right? Now, that is a social force or social artifact that is indicative of our disconnection from place. So when I say invest in the local, I want you to think in terms of time as well. So soil, yes. People, yes. PTA, yes. But time, yes. Because how long does it take for someone to experience the love of God through you? It could be a moment, but in many cases, it takes much, much longer than that. And I want to encourage folks to think, not just the not just the community garden, but also the longevity of your relationships in a neighborhood that you come to really care for, because your welfare is bound up with the welfare of others.
I love it. That's such a fitting note to conclude on. It ties in very well with this. I'm seeing a lot coming up on my social media feeds, on my internet searches about the crisis of loneliness, the
Yeah.
crisis of not having friendships. And you're pointing us to some of the conditions for the possibility of friendship, namely time, soil, just proximity to people, and in showing up relationally and socially, and how I think pastors know this. I think pastors understand the difficulty of longevity within a certain place with a certain people, and how that is a precondition for people feeling the love of God. So there's such wisdom in what you're describing, Jeff, and our wide ranging conversation. I feel like there has been a thread throughout all of this. We began with ministry to Asian American Gen Z on campus. That was kind of a thread throughout, but we've covered so much ground in addition to that. And I just want to thank you for being such a dynamic conversation partner.
Mm. Thank you, David. Really appreciate all your questions and your synthesis and your research and experience.